Our second speaker is Natalie Bain-Reguis, Associate Researcher at Edinburgh Napier University. Natalie has a background in building physics. She's been looking at ventilation strategies and thermal comfort in Scottish classrooms, i.e. exactly, the issues, some of the issues that Mike flagged up, and the impacts on the health and well-being of teachers. So Natalie, welcome. And I think you are able to share your screen now, if you, because I know you have a presentation you should share.
Many thanks, Almus, for the presentation, and good afternoon to everyone. So I'm going to present my work related to education and what we have learned from COVID, and it's going to be very similar to what Mike has just said. You will see. So I started being involved in schools and COVID issues in 2019, so a few months after the pandemic started. And sorry, I cannot move this. Here we go. So I'm not going to explain in detail the transmission and contamination modes of airborne viruses. I'm sure you're all aware of this, but I just wanted to insist on the importance of ventilations as mitigation measure for this type of transmission. That in mind, these are the three key points I'm going to talk about today. So before exploring the impact on ventilation and how to enhance it, we are first going to have a look at the regulations for ventilation in classrooms in Scotland. Then I will report on the study I've done in 2 schools during the COVID pandemic. And finally, I will mention how to enhance filtration. And all this, after each key point, I will suggest key actions. So first, here are the Scottish regulations in schools as of March 2020. So classrooms should be at least 70 degrees Celsius. The CO2 level should be 800 ppm max in music rooms and sports halls, and 1,500 in normal classrooms. Measuring the CO2 levels gives a good indication on how well an indoor space is ventilated and has been proven to be a good proxy for ventilation. But we know that very often CO2 levels are above the 1,500 ppm max. So I've done a review of other regulations and guidelines in other countries. So that's what you can see here. So on your left, you can see the countries and the red bars represent the countries with regulations, the blue ones, the countries with guidelines. And then on the far right, you see the international organizations like the WHO, ASHRAE, RIVA, and CIPSI. So we can notice that Scotland, which has a maximum of 1,500 ppm, is above the CO2 level average of 1,100 and something. And is way above the 994 ppm recommendation by the international organization. 7 countries have tightened their maximum CO2 level since the pandemic, so that's a good point to note as well. Now, looking at the minimum ventilation rates, so it's above in Scotland, most of the other countries. Just touching on this. Then about relative humidity. So that's the last point I wanted to mention. So when because relative humidity has an impact on the indoor quality of a room. So when it's above 60%, mold can start developing. And when it's below 40%, the air becomes too dry and the viruses can spread more easily. So numerous studies have identified the relative humidity sweet spot between 40 and 60%. But the thing is that in the UK, there is no currently mandatory legal requirements to control relative humidity. So regarding the regulation in schools classroom, the suggestion would be to align the figures to the strictest findings. So having 800 ppm as a max for the CO2, ventilation rates above 12.5 and relative humidity between 40 and 60. I've been really quick on this, but yeah, in my mind, it's important to make the distinction between regulations and guidelines. So regulations are enforceable by law, which should be the case for that type of topic. Now moving to the second key point about ventilation. So this diagram from Jones and colleagues are showing the 3 steps to reduce airborne virus propagation. So the first step would be to know what type of ventilation we have in the room. and then act accordingly to your findings. And the second and third steps are about air filtration and air cleaners, which will be detailed in our third key point. So first, finding out which ventilation we've got in the room. So depending on the type of ventilation, if it's natural or mechanical, there are different strategies to put in place. So for natural ventilation, cross ventilation is the most effective way to ventilate, as it takes only 7 minutes to replace the air in the space compared to 45 minutes when there is only one single opening, or several hours if all the doors and windows are shut. For mechanical ventilations, the system should be kept at 24/7 running with no air recirculation. So very early on, during the first lockdown, the City of Edinburgh Council asked me to do a study looking at the CO2 levels and ventilation rates in different schools, classrooms around the city. And the outcomes were that when classrooms had well-maintained mechanical ventilations, the CO2 were within the regulation limits. So meaning below 1,500. That's what they were looking for. We know that's not, well, it's still too high, but it was within the regulations. But for naturally ventilated classrooms, it was a lot more difficult to keep those CO2 levels within range, so below the 1,500. Following these findings, I wanted to explore more what can be done to enhance the ventilation in naturally ventilated primary schools. So the council manages 89 primary schools, and 90% of which are naturally ventilated. Also, the Scottish government allocated £10 million to local authorities to have CO2 monitors deployed in their schools. So I took this opportunity to look at the impact of such measures, and I took two similar Victorian primary schools with sash and case windows. So School T, where visual and non-visual monitors were deployed in 10 classrooms, and School S, where only non-visual monitors were deployed in 10 classrooms. I have recorded a webinar, so all the teachers from both schools could watch, and where I explain the importance of indoor air quality, how to use the visual CO2 monitors, and how to enhance, practically how to enhance ventilation in their classrooms. I have monitored the indoor environment, so temperature, relative humidity, and CO2 for 8 months. And I've also asked the teachers to fill in surveys to explore what they felt about the physical and mental well-being, but this is not I'm not going to talk about this today. So the results of this study showed that raising awareness via the webinar helped reduce 7% of the CO2 levels in School T and 5% in School S. But when the schools had, in addition to the webinar, visual feedback monitors, then the CO2 was reduced by 14%. So you can see on this graph that the CO2 for S is in red and T is in blue, and then there's a difference between the two. So the blue one is where classrooms had visual monitors, and the red one when they didn't. Another outcome of this study, when looking at the CO2 levels of individual classrooms of School T, so only the schools where the teachers had visual monitors, it was how the teachers themselves used those monitors. So 2 of the 10 teachers of this School T had really low CO2 level throughout the study. So I went and asked them what was their strategy, and they both said that they kept the upper pane of the sash and case window always open, even during the cold months. And they used the visual monitor to open and close the bottom pane. So when it was too cold, they were closing it, but keeping an eye on the CO2 level. And when the CO2 level was too high, they were opening the bottom pane, keeping the upper pane always open. And that way the classroom was well ventilated without being cold. So that's one classroom, one of the teachers who has done this. So you can see most of the CO2 levels throughout the year is around 800 ppm, with peaks a little bit higher, up to 1,000, but well, generally it's acceptable. But I would add the last comment. It's related to when a supply teacher was in this classroom 1 week towards the end of the study. It was in June, so the weather was not too cold. And as you can see, so During the previous weeks, as I've said, all the CO2 levels are very irregular and mostly around 800 ppm. And the normal class teacher was one of the two who are really, who I've mentioned, and really used the strategy with the windows and the visual sensor. But towards the end, there is a big difference in CO2 levels, reaching above 1,600 ppm. And the supply teacher was unaware of the study and didn't know how to ventilate, nor to use the CO2 monitor, not even to look at it. He didn't even know he had a CO2 monitor in his classroom. So these observations led to this conclusion: to enhance ventilation in this classroom effectively, first occupants need to be aware, meaning they need to know what indoor air quality is, why it is important, and how to enhance it in their classroom, but also have a CO2 monitor to check levels regularly to be able to act accordingly. And the second element, the occupant needs to be willing to act. The teachers are already overwhelmed at the work they have to do to teach their pupils. It is understandable that managing the ventilation of their classroom can add pressure to their workload. That's actually what a lot of teachers said when they have been filling in the survey I've asked them to do. But in times of pandemic, they need to know and act accordingly to reduce the risk of viruses spreading. Therefore, the proposed actions on ventilations could be: so indoor air quality modules during teachers' training, so they will know how to manage their own classroom, developing CPD as well to raise awareness and, well, explain how to ventilate and use visual monitors, buying the appropriate CO2 monitors, so with the NDIR technology for CO2, and they should be also able to monitor relative humidity, having a dynamic alerting system, so either traffic lights, visual, or even acoustic, but that can be disruptive. Having a user guide in every classroom specific to the classroom the teacher is in. And finally, clean air champions, so where pupils are in charge of the ventilation of their classroom. So the clean air champions is to reduce the pressure from the teachers, but also to educate children from a young age to ventilate properly, and then they will become part of the Scottish culture. I have been involved in actions to reduce outdoor air pollution this year in Edinburgh. And the program has been delivered in 20 primary schools around the city, to finish by an event at the city chambers where 200 attendees came, including councillors, MSPs, and MPs. So we could do something similar for indoor air. The last slide is about the third key point, and it's filtration and air cleaners. So multiple studies have shown the positive benefits of such measures. And adding HEPA filters in classrooms can be done by buying off the shelf, or also by building your own Corsi box. My 12-year-old at the time has been able to build one herself.
Thank you very much, Natalie. That was great. And I have one question in the chat, just for clarifying, asking if you could just explain again about the impact of relative humidity, what you mentioned about that earlier. That would, if you could just explain that again, please.
Yes. So relative humidity, when it's too high, when the humidity is too high, above 60%, that means that mold can develop inside, and then it has been shown to be linked to asthma issues. But when the relative humidity is too low, so below 40%, then it's too dry. And then that means that our airways are too dry, and that's a very good way of catching viruses more easily. But also because of the size of the virus, then they are transported by humidity. So if it's the humidity, well, if it's too dry, basically the virus is not going to be, well, it's going to be more able to spread. I hope I'm clear enough. Let me know.
Yeah, thank you.